There is a place in central Italy that, for nearly 400 years, did not officially exist. It appeared on no agreed boundary. It answered to no sovereign power. And yet, people were born there, lived there, and built their lives in a space that two governments had simply failed to claim. Before dawn, in a narrow valley between low green hills, a man steps into the cool air and tends his tobacco plants. The soil is damp with the breath of nearby tributaries of the Tiber. The leaves are wide, heavy with moisture. No tax collector will come today. No Papal official will arrive to demand tithe or service. He is not a subject. He is not a citizen. Simply exists in a place that, by the logic of two great powers, does not quite exist at all. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. This is Cospaia, a small pocket of land tucked into the hills of central Italy. For nearly 400 years, between 1441 and 1826, it occupied a peculiar position in the political geography of the Italian peninsula, a community that found itself outside the formal jurisdiction of its neighbors, and which sustained itself through that ambiguity for generations. Its story begins not with revolution, not with war, but with the far more human problem of imprecision. In the 15th century, the Italian peninsula was a mosaic of competing powers. The Papal States stretched across central Italy, their authority derived from the church and enforced through governance. To the north and west, Florence under the Medici family was consolidating its own influence, pressing outward. In 1440, Florence defeated Niccolò Piccinino at the Battle of Anghiari, shifting the balance of power. The following year, in 1441, Pope Eugenius IV sold a portion of territory to the Florentines. The agreement involved land in the upper Tiber Valley, and it required a defined boundary. The boundary was set along a watercourse. Here the trouble began. The territory was described with reference to a specific stream, but maps of the era were imprecise instruments. Two different streams ran through the area, and documents left room for interpretation. One stream, the Rio Cospaia, sat slightly to the north. Another lay further south. Between them, a small strip of land, populated by a scattered community of farming families. This was not a clerical error in the simple sense, not a letter miswritten or a number transposed. It was an ambiguity in the surveying and documentation of a boundary endemic to that period. Both parties appear to have believed they had a coherent understanding of the border. What neither party noticed or found convenient to press was that the gap left land unclaimed, and into that gap, a community quietly settled its own affairs. Cospaia was not a state in any formal sense. It had no written constitution, no hereditary ruler, no standing army, no judicial apparatus in the modern meaning of the term. What it had was something more organic, a community that governed itself through consensus, through the authority of local families, and through the informal norms that develop whenever people live in proximity. A council of elders appears to have played a coordinating role in community decisions. There were no formal statutes, but there were expectations about property, disputes, and trade. These expectations gave daily life a recognizable structure. The phrase perpetual freedom was often attached to Cospaia. It came from the community's own self-understanding, capturing something real, though it requires qualification. This wasn't abstract liberty, it was practical freedom, living outside the administrative and fiscal reach of surrounding powers. No formal taxes by external sovereigns, no conscription into foreign armies. The community's internal arrangements were entirely its own. This was no utopia. It's a mistake to romanticize it. Communities without formal legal systems still generate hierarchies, stronger families, accumulated influence. Disputes weren't always fair to the weaker party. No formal state didn't mean no power. It meant power arranged itself by different rules. Cospaia offered absence of external domination, not absence of internal complexity. For generations, this arrangement held. The community persisted. In the 17th century, it found an economic foundation that would define its independence. Tobacco arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 16th century. The spread was rapid, complicated, and contested. By the 17th century, tobacco was popular, but deeply problematic for states and the church. Pope Urban VIII, in 1642, forbade tobacco in sacred spaces, threatening excommunication for violators. Concerns were moral and about disruptions in church. States across Europe recognized tobacco as an economic resource worth controlling. Monopolies were established, production regulated, taxes levied on its sale and distribution. For Cospaia, this presented an extraordinary opportunity. Located between Papal States and Florentine territory, Cospaia could grow and trade tobacco without restrictions burdening others. The plant suited the landscape, and economic incentive was significant. Cospaia became a tobacco hub, supplying regulated territories. This wasn't smuggling violating Cospaia's laws, as there were none prohibiting it. It operated in a gray space. Buyers came because Cospaia offered what the formal market could not: tobacco sold outside state control. The tobacco economy gave the community a material reason to maintain its independence. Its neighbors had a complicated relationship. Cospaia was a nuisance, a gap in the regulatory fabric. From another perspective, it was simply a market. And markets attract participants whether or not the theoretical framework surrounding them is tight. Which brings us to a question that deserves serious consideration. Why did the neighboring powers tolerate this arrangement for so long? The answer lies in the intersection of convenience, proportion, and competing priorities. For much of Cospaia's existence, the strip of land it occupied was simply not worth a diplomatic confrontation. Resolving the boundary ambiguity would have required both the Papal States and whatever Florentine or later Tuscan authority held the adjacent land to agree on a new demarcation. That process carried costs: legal, diplomatic, political, and the prize at the end was a community of farmers on a few square kilometers of hilly terrain. There is also the matter of what such a resolution would have required: either power to acknowledge. To claim Cospaia, a power would have had to concede that its boundary with the other was unsettled, opening a renegotiation that neither may have found advantageous. Sometimes ambiguity is the stable equilibrium precisely because resolving it creates new uncertainties. The tobacco trade complicated this calculus. Cospaia's economic activity was, at various points, a source of irritation to neighboring authorities who saw their own regulatory frameworks being circumvented. But irritation and existential threat are different categories of problem. A community of a few hundred people growing tobacco in the hills of central Italy was never a military challenge. It was an administrative inconvenience. And administrative inconveniences, when the machinery required to address them is expensive and the political will is absent, have a way of persisting. What finally ended Cospaia's independent existence was not a military campaign or a sudden crisis. It was the gradual shift of the political world around it, and eventually the accumulation of conditions that made absorption simpler than continued ambiguity. In 1826, Cospaia was formally incorporated into the Papal States. The annexation appears to have been peaceful. The community's residents did not resist in any organized fashion, and the terms of incorporation reflected some accommodation of their situation rather than a punitive imposition. By the early 19th century, the political landscape of the Italian peninsula had changed substantially from the world in which the boundary ambiguity first arose. The Napoleonic reorganization of Europe had disrupted and then partially restored the old structures of Italian governance. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn borders and reconsolidated authorities. The administrative machinery of the Papal States had been modernized and made more systematic. In this context, a small strip of unclaimed land sat differently in the political imagination than it had in the looser governance environment of earlier centuries. There was also, perhaps simply a generation of officials for whom the unresolved status of Cospaia was no longer an inherited assumption, but an anomaly that invited correction. When the will existed on one side and the capacity for peaceful resolution existed on both, the long ambiguity came to an end. The tobacco economy did not immediately vanish, but it no longer operated outside the fiscal reach of a sovereign. The informal Council of Elders was absorbed into the structures of the Papal States. The community continued to exist as a place, a hamlet in San Giustino, Umbria, but its peculiar constitutional status became history. There is a temptation to reach for large conclusions when encountering a story like Cospaia's, to see in it a vindication of some political philosophy, or a proof that communities can flourish without states, or a cautionary tale about the fragility of human freedom. These readings are not entirely wrong, but they import more meaning than the evidence strictly supports. What Cospaia actually illustrates is something more specific, and, in its own way, more interesting. The degree to which boundaries and jurisdictions are contingent achievements rather than natural features. They require sustained effort, ongoing agreement, and administrative machinery to maintain. When that machinery breaks down, or was never adequately assembled, gaps appear. And in those gaps, people make arrangements. The Cospaia arrangements lasted as long as they did not because they were philosophically optimal, but because they were practically stable. The community had an economy. Its neighbors had limited incentives to intervene. The ambiguity that gave birth to the situation continued to protect it. This is not the story of human freedom defeating the state. It is the story of a system failure creating a space, and people filling that space. The freedom was real, but its origin was not heroic. It was accidental. And that, perhaps, is the most honest thing that can be said about Cospaia. It did not represent the triumph of any principle. It represented the persistence of a community in conditions that happened to permit that persistence. We live today in a world that has largely resolved its territorial ambiguities. The blank spaces on the map have been filled in, surveyed, administered, and incorporated. The conditions that produced Cospaia, overlapping claims, imprecise maps, are rarer. And yet the underlying dynamic is not entirely gone. Administrative systems still generate gaps. Jurisdictions still overlap in ways that create ambiguity. Regulatory frameworks still differ. Space between them carries economic significance. The mechanisms are different. The stakes for the individuals involved are often the same. Cospaia, viewed from the distance of centuries, is a reminder of something quiet and persistent. About the relationship between formal authority and the communities it claims to govern. Authority rests on maps, and maps are human constructions. The line on paper is not the same as the ground beneath people's feet. For nearly 400 years, a community in central Italy demonstrated exactly how much space can exist between the two. The tobacco leaves have long since been harvested. The last council of elders dispersed into the records of the Papal States. The village remains modest and quiet in the green hills of Umbria, but the questions it poses have no closing date. Questions about borders, belonging, and the basis on which authority claims its reach. They are, like all the best questions, still growing. Cospaia was never meant to last. It was not built on conquest, or law, or design. It existed in the space between definitions, a place where authority hesitated, where maps failed to agree, where the machinery of power simply did not reach.
No.
And for nearly 4 centuries, that was enough. Enough for a community to grow, for lives to be lived outside structures. Enough to prove that sometimes the most enduring systems are not the ones that are built, but the ones that are overlooked. But even overlooked places do not remain invisible forever. Eventually the maps were corrected, the lines were redrawn, and the space that had allowed Cospaia to exist quietly closed. The people remained, the land remained. But the anomaly, the fragile gap that made it all possible, disappeared. What Cospaia leaves behind is not a blueprint for freedom, nor a warning written in fire. It is something quieter than that. A reminder that the systems we trust are not permanent. Borders, laws, authority itself, they are agreements, maintained, revised, and sometimes forgotten. And in those moments of forgetting, something unusual can take root. If this story has stayed with you, continue the journey. Subscribe to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. Join us as we explore where history slips through the cracks, where the overlooked becomes the most revealing. I'd like to hear from you. You think freedom is something that can be built, or does it only exist where systems fail? Share your thoughts below. Your voice is part of what keeps these stories alive. Thank you for walking this forgotten boundary with me. Until the next whisper, stay curious, stay safe.